afternoon. Welcome to our class. I want to thank Jeff and Lori Goldchen for sponsoring today. This is an honor. For all those that need health and healing, we should give a prayer and a blessing that all those should be healed. There should be a refuah shalema for anyone in need of it. Thank you very much, Jeff and Lori. We're going to continue today where we left off last week. The verse in Deuteronomy chapter 12 speaks about entering the land of Israel. And once you conquer the land and settle the land, you're going to build a home for God, a Beit HaMikdash, a holy temple, in a designated city and a designated place. We know it as Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. And it is there at this Temple Mount, at this structure, at this holy temple, that you will bring all the offerings that are talked about in the 5 books of Moses. So early on in the book of Exodus, we had the idea of a Paschal lamb being brought to celebrate the holiday of Passover. The book of Leviticus is filled with all different offerings that were brought for so many different reasons. You brought an offering if you were in the mood to come closer to God. You brought an offering if you wanted to say thank you to God. You brought an offering if you wanted to say I'm sorry to God. That was called a Karban Chatas. For various different errors, we brought different offerings. For different holidays, we brought offerings. There was a daily offering that was brought in the temple on behalf of all of us. There was an afternoon offering that was brought on behalf of all of us. There was an offering that was brought on Rosh Chodesh. There was an offering that was brought in different holidays. The entire book of Leviticus talks about so many different offerings, but those offerings were only allowed in the tabernacle that was built in the wilderness and then brought in for the first few hundred years in Israel, and then later at the site of the Holy Temple. It was not something you just did in your backyard. And that's what we started discussing last week, this whole idea of the animal offerings, or in some cases they weren't animals, in some cases it was flour and oil that were brought as an offering as well. But we started trying to have an understanding of what was this about this animal offering. And we first started talking about don't be squirmish about the fact that the Torah talks about animal offerings, because we each seem to have no problem eating dinner every night. Some of you, if you'd like to have schnitzel for lunch, you have no problem eating lunch every day. And if you have tuna fish, that also was alive just a few days ago. So the idea that we eat animals is part of our lives. The exception, as I mentioned last week, are the vegetarians that refuse to eat any animal. But even in the question on the vegetarian is, there's life there too. There's life in the tomato, there's life in the cucumber, there's life in the carrot. It does have life as it's growing until you decide to cut it off. Why? Because you're hungry. Or the example I gave is a dozen roses. What right do you have to kill, to murder 12 roses because you want to say I love you? Write it out. But the florist seems to want to convince you that the only way to really say you love someone is by getting them a dozen roses. Now, it is very nice and it is very pretty. You got, how are we doing? We're back on? I think we need a battery. We have them in there. The battery? They have in there, yeah. But does that give you a right? It's in this cabinet here, Jacob. This cabinet. Yeah. It's this kind. Does that give you a right to go ahead and end the life of 12 long stem roses? The fact that you want it, that you want to give it to your spouse, or you want to put it on your Shabbat table. So we all accept that there's certain type of hierarchy in which we seem to have this right to go ahead and do. That we have a right to use flowers, that we have a right to eat cucumbers, and that we have a right to eat the animal and the fowl and fish. Now, when it comes to animal, there was. Hello? I didn't turn it off.
Get it battery.
Okay. So it's the early on in the creation of the world, God goes ahead and gives the human being permission to eat of the animal. Doesn't give us permission to torture an animal. Doesn't give us permission to do with an animal as we please. But it does give us permission to eat the animal. And then we find this idea of offerings, that animals are brought as an offering to God. As I mentioned last week, we find that in the book of Genesis, before there is a Mount Sinai, before there is a Jewish people, we find the story of Abel bringing an offering to God. We find Noah bringing offerings to God. We find Abraham bringing offerings to God, Isaac bringing offerings to God, Jacob bringing offerings to God. So we find that part of the book of Genesis before there is the instruction of doing so. So very clearly God does go ahead and give the permission, but I think the question we really want to know is, where is the sanctity of it? Where is the holiness of it? That there's literally an entire book of the 5 books of Moses devoted to the different types of animals that are being brought, to what part of the animal goes to the Kohen, what part of the animal goes to the person bringing the offering, what part of the animal is brought onto the altar, and you start reading it and you wonder, is it really that important? So much detail on these animal offerings. So ultimately, we need to accept that there's a natural order of things in creation. And the natural order is not an invention. That it's built into the world by a designer, the designer being the creator by God Almighty. Let me explain. The mineral world feeds the vegetative world. The vegetative world needs the minerals that are part of the world. The vegetative world feeds the animal world. And the animal world feeds the human, and the human serves God. That ultimately there is a chain reaction of one level of creation going up to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. The human, whose task it is to serve God, is the only of all the above creations that has the ability to choose to serve God, to make a choice, a free choice. The sun and the moon and the stars, in any way that they serve God, can serve God by being. The stars don't wake up one night and say, today, should we daven Ma'ariv or not? Are we putting on tefillin today? Yes or no? Are we keeping kosher today? It doesn't have that ability to make choices. It's created by God, and it serves God by just being. By being what it was created to be. And the same with vegetative world, the mineral world, the animal world. They just are. By nature, they are what they were created to be. And it's very hard to change that nature. Again, I often use Shamu and SeaWorld as an example. Shamu always remained a whale. As much as we want to put character on Shamu, and we do, as much as we want to think that Shamu was really smiling to you, Shamu was hungry. And Shamu was trained that it gets those other fish that are put into its mouth. If it makes something that you think is a smile, Shamu, it's just exercising the mouth. And when Shamu splashed you because you sat in the splash zone, trust me, Shamu did not study the idea of a splash zone and does not understand why kids think it's exciting to get soaking wet. But it knows that if it splashes in this area of the pool, and that area of the pool, and that area of the pool, it gets more fish. It's a natural response. It's not a choice response. The human has a choice response. The human makes a free choice. And the choice that is being asked, is to serve God by your own intellect, by your own knowledge, by your own choosing. The mineral, the vegetative, and the animal worlds all serve man so that man can serve God and thereby elevate it. And the human thereby elevates all of these creations. So we're not just the only ones serving God, we're taking all the other elements of this world and we're elevating it when we serve God. Because we benefited from the mineral world, we benefited from the vegetative world, and we benefited from the animal world. And thereby, if we use the benefits that we got from all of these other worlds, and we elevate that by our serving God, we've thereby elevated the entire world. Man is the apex of creation. It's the top of the pyramid. And when man then consumes meat and uses that energy to do something positive with it, the animal has now transcended its limits, and it's now fulfilling its mission to serve God as well. The Talmud says the entire world was created to serve me, that any human being can say that. All of the world was created to help me out, and I was created to serve my Creator. So in some type of way, I benefit from every creation of God in this world. Some I understand, some I don't. I'm not sure I understand lizards and alligators, but I'm not God. He figures it out why the world needs every one of these creations, every one of these animals, where these animals dwell, what their purpose is, what their need is. You know, there's the story of King David that questioned God about a spider. And he said, I've been able to figure out a lot about God's creation, but I have this mystery about the spider. Why the spider? Now, I know we all have some reasons as to why King David knew those reasons, but it wasn't good enough for him. And then there's a story about in King David's life, he's hiding in the cave as King Saul is looking for him before he's king. And he's hunting for him. And he's looking to kill David before he ever becomes king. And he's hiding in this cave. And Saul ends up coming into that very same cave to relieve himself. And the spider comes up and creates this web hiding David. And David looks to God and says, all right, it's a good answer. So some we get, some we understand, but the whole idea is that everything that God created somehow benefits the human. And the human has then the energy it needs to serve God. This does not mean that we're allowed to abuse the environment. Just because it was created for us doesn't mean we can abuse it. It doesn't mean we can abuse or torture the animal world. Doesn't mean we're allowed to chop down a tree just because it's in our way. There are a lot of laws in the code of Jewish law about the removal of a tree. When you're allowed to remove a tree, when not? Because the tree is alive too. A lot of laws about animal treatment and how animals can be treated. Yes, permission was given to you to eat animal, but it doesn't mean the animal world is given over to you to do as you please. A lot of ethical questions come up, obviously, when it comes to testing done on animals. Does the human benefit from it, or is it just for curiosity? Think for a moment just of the laws of the Torah when it comes to consuming food. Think about the Jewish laws that we have, the Torah laws, biblical laws for the Jew. The Torah will tell us you can eat this food, but you can't eat this food. The Torah will tell you you can slaughter an animal this way, but not that way. The Torah will tell us about trees, that the tree can grow the first 3 years, you can't even take a fruit off the tree. The Torah will tell you that the 7th year of every growth of a tree has to remain, and you can't touch it. The Torah will tell you that 6 days of the week you can burn fuel, but you can't do it on the 7th. The Torah will tell you you can't take wool and linen and mix it together. The Torah will govern our behavior as it relates to all of the creations of the world. So just because it's all there to serve you and to benefit you doesn't mean you have this carte blanche, this freedom to do with it as you please. Not so. The Torah will govern our behavior as it relates to God's world. But where it is permissible, when we have an opportunity to serve God, we elevate all of these other levels of creation. Indeed, the Talmud will ask this question. The Talmud will ask, the person who doesn't serve God then, what right does that person have to eat animal? If the only reason God gave us permission to eat animal is to elevate and to serve God with that energy, what if the person's not serving God? And the Talmud is left with this question of, have you earned your right? Now, obviously, we're not going to start putting out a law that if you're an atheist, you can't eat meat. But the Talmud just gets into this debate showing us that the main focus of why permission was given is to give you the strength to be able to serve God better. So on a simplistic level, if you have no problem with the lunch or dinner ritual, you should have no problem with temple offerings. Let's pick an example. The Karban Shlomim. It was one of the offerings that are brought down in the book of Leviticus. It was called the peace offering. And in this offering, a goat was slaughtered in the most painless manner. Its blood was sprinkled on the sides of the altar. Certain veins and fat were removed and burned on the altar top. 2 of its cut choices of meat were given as gifts to the priests who were involved in bringing the offering. The rest of the meat was eaten by the one who brought the offering, but only under strict conditions of ritual purity. So let's analyze this. The goat was slaughtered. Well, we established that God granted permission for the consumption of the animal world by man. No hunting is allowed, no torture of animals allowed. We said the goat was slaughtered. It wasn't slaughtered as are millions of animals daily to satisfy billions of Big Macs that are served all over the world. It was slaughtered in a ritual way, which involved the cutting of the windpipe in one swift move that causes no pain to the animal. The blood represents, remember I said the blood was sprinkled on the altar? What's that all about? The blood represents the fervor and the passion of the material world. And we seek to give this over to God. That we use our passion and our fervor that we have as part of our human being to devote ourselves to God. Then I said that some of the fat and the veins were put onto the altar and burnt on the altar. What does the fat represent? It represents excessive indulgence. It represents different pleasure seeking. And we give that drive over to God as well. Then I said part of the meat was shared with the Kohen, because life is not just about ourselves, it's about sharing. It's about others benefiting from that which we have. So in every altar of the offering, there was this idea of share. Give something to someone else. The rest, I said, was eaten in purity, focusing on the ultimate mission in life, is to live a pure life. So on a simplistic level, if we engage in eating, and we have little problem with that, then we should have little problem with animal sacrifices that were brought in the days of the temple. But it doesn't answer the question that I began with. And the question is, let's put it this way. Let's suppose I go out, for whatever reason, I make a mistake, I make an error, and I sin. I violate one of the commandments. It wasn't on purpose, it wasn't intentional, it was an accident. And the Torah tells me, if you do that and you feel bad about it and you want to correct your ways, you bring a karban chatas, you bring this sin offering. So, or the example I said earlier, I'm just in this generous mood and I want to offer something to God. I'm in a good mood. I want to say thank you to God or I love you to God. Different offerings. You kind of feel like, what did the animal do here? I understand you want to eat some meat, but you want to come closer to God. What has the animal got to do with it? If you want to come closer to God, do something that you are coming closer to God. You go ahead, you go to the butcher shop, you bring an animal, you bring it to the holy temple, they slaughter it there. What does it have to do with me? With me wanting to get closer to God? So you need to understand that the offering was a symbol of the mental focus and commitment that was going on at the time. Sometimes we're getting carried away with the ritual and we're not realizing what the ritual actually represented. What was going on at the time? Meaning, if one was bringing a sin offering, like an example I gave, I committed a sin and I want atonement for it, the Torah will teach me about the sin offering, but don't think for a moment that this meant that you sin and you drop off a lamb chop and it's all good. You needed to seek forgiveness. The whole role of the Kohen that's talked about in the book of Leviticus. The Kohen's role was to be that not the butcher, but he was in a way the rabbi. He was the spiritual guide. He was the counselor. He was the therapist. You first sat and you spoke to him about what happened. Why are you here today? Not as a confession booth. He doesn't atone. He doesn't forgive. All he does is trying to teach you how you atone to God. He's your guide. So there was literally a session that would take place between you and the Kohen. This was your synagogue. You were going there to feel closer to God. This individual was trained to try to lead you closer to God. The animal sacrifice, that was what was part of the ritual when the verbal was completed. When we went through the discussion. Now let's bring this offering as a way to show what we just accomplished here. But every step of the way of the offering, every part of the process of the offering was a continuous reminder of this discussion. So when we sprinkled the blood on the altar, this was about the idea of the passion that you have should be devoted to God. When we burnt the fat of the offering, it was, what does the fat represent? This is what you were going through, that you're going to start devoting more of yourself to God. The law states that if, let's suppose, during the entire process of the offering, either the person bringing the offering or the Kohen himself just daydreamed and they forgot the focus of what they were doing there. His cell phone rang in the middle, or he gets this text message in the middle, and it says, the Yankees just blew it again in the bottom of the ninth. Ah, shucks, them Yankees, a $300 million payroll, and you're only at 500? Fire the manager. We just got distracted, right? If that happens in the middle of the offering, guess what? The offering is no good. You got disqualified. It's not the bringing of the offering that mattered. It was you that mattered. The offering was just symbolic of your focus on godliness. And during the entire time that the offering had to be brought, you needed to be focused on what it is that you were doing there. Let's jump to today. We don't have a holy temple. Remember I said, you can only do these animal offerings in the days of the holy temple. When the holy temple was destroyed, none of these animal offerings took place, which means for thousands of years, we didn't practice any of this. So on the day of the destruction of the temple, the men of the Great Assembly get together. And they say, what do we do? What do we do? There's no more animal offerings. There's no more holy temple. What do we do in place of it? And looking into the words of the prophets, and I'll show you some of these words either this week or next week, they came up with the synagogue, the Beit HaKnesset. Prayer will replace the animal offering. Words will replace the animal. So what we're going to do is we're going to gather together every morning, afternoon, and evening, and we're going to say the prayers. And in the prayers, we're going to talk about the offerings that used to be brought, and we're going to focus. And when it comes to the holiday, we're going to say extra prayer. And when it comes to Shabbat, we're going to say an extra prayer. And every day we're going to do this. Remember this? You do this in Yom Kippur? Well, we do this every day, twice a day as well. We ask forgiveness. So we're going to use words. Since we can't bring an offering, we're going to use prayer. We're going to use the house of prayer. We're going to use a synagogue, a Beit HaKnesset. We're going to use a congregation as our way to connect. And the advantage that you have in a synagogue is that it's not just in one location. Wherever it is that we were exiled, you're going to take the synagogue with you. So as Rome came in and they destroyed Jerusalem and they burnt the temple to the ground, and the Jewish people were now scattered to all parts of the earth, they had from the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the guide of how Judaism will live on. And wherever you go, you will create a house of prayer, a synagogue for people to go to, and offer their offerings of words. No more animal offerings until the Messiah comes, until the Holy Temple is rebuilt. What we have in its place are our prayers. So the synagogue has become the miniature Holy Temple today. And the rabbi has become the Kohen of the day. And the altar, that's our prayers. Now, as powerful as a replacement that our synagogues and prayers for all the services for the temple are, nevertheless, we know it's still not the real thing. Because when you open the book of Leviticus and it talks about all the offerings, we know we've only replaced it with something because we don't have the Holy Temple. It's not the real thing yet. And so we yearn for the return of the temple. And we say it in our prayers every single day. We pray to God that He bring back the temple life comes back, and we all restore to the kingdom of Judah, to the kingdom of the Messiah, and we all move to Israel, and we go and we bring our offerings in the Holy Temple. But until that day comes, it's prayer. So you may ask, and it's a legitimate question to ask, doesn't prayer seem more fitting than animal sacrifice when we're talking about spirituality? It's an honest question. What has a more spiritual feel? Going to a synagogue, whether it's a beautiful synagogue, a humble synagogue, a poor synagogue, but being there with a bunch of Jews, taking out your prayer book, and reading beautiful words written by great spiritual poets, written by King David, yearning to be close to God, thanking God, saying words of gratitude to God. Some synagogues, maybe they break out in song at some points. They sing a happy song. They sing an intense song. You clap along a little bit. Some synagogues, Friday night, you do a little dance in the middle. Or go to a slaughterhouse and see a bunch of animals lined up to be slaughtered. Which one gives more of a spiritual feel? Anyone been to a slaughterhouse? Anyone? I've been to one. As part of the ordination process, we actually had to go and see what it looks like and what the lungs of an animal look like and why certain animals are considered glatt kosher and certain animals are not glatt kosher. We had to study on the scene. I don't know if they still do it today, but in my days, yes, we actually went. Not so spiritual feel. No. Not really. I can't say it was one of my favorite days of yeshiva learning. I was looking where I can hide. I was making sure these cows are not loose. And even the ones that are already gone, that they're flying by on these big hooks. Now, I'm trying to imagine the Holy Temple. Probably a lot of barbecuing going on in there, right? A lot of work. Okay, there was a nice part that there was a menorah there, and they lit the menorah. Okay, that was nice. There was an altar of spice. It probably smelled very good. That's good. There was a part that was called the daily bread that was baked. It probably smelled like delicious challah coming out of the oven. That's good. But you get close to that big altar where everyone's bringing their offerings, and there's thousands of kohanim helping people bring their offering, which means there's thousands of animals all over the place, of all types of animals that are being brought. How spiritual can it possibly be? So we have this prayer thing that they came up with, and it was saying, like, now that we have this, why are we saying we long for the days of the return of the animal offering if we figured out how a nicer way, a more spiritual way perhaps, a more refined way to serve God? So it's a good question. My attempt to explain this, our weakness in understanding things generations later many times comes from a lack of perspective. Which means we're looking back at something we read about that they did thousands of years ago, and to us, what we're doing seems a lot cleaner, neater, holier, more spiritual. I get that. But to truly understand an event and its significance, you need to have the background of what was really going on. And without it, your understanding is limited, and thus leads us to what we can call an inaccurate conclusion. We can think that an event was insignificant, was unimportant, or barbaric, or it just belonged in archaic times. Let me give you an example. Without the background, so let's pick someone, whether they come from Mars or a third world country. They've never seen things before. Okay, so they're new on the scene. Just imagine with me. And they're brought into a room where a Brit Milah is taking place. A circumcision is taking place. Okay? Remember, they don't know that it's part of the Bible. They don't know that thousands of years have gone by that we have done this. They don't know that millions of people have they know nothing. And we park them right in the front. And they can't figure out what's going on. They see the food table in the back. That they have an understanding of. It smells good. It looks good. When are we getting there? Soon. We have a ritual to do. You have this group of adults, and they're crowding around this baby. The baby is 8 days old. A little baby. You got a videographer videotaping as this masked man takes off his diaper. Why are you videotaping? It's private. Even if the baby is 8 days old, stop the pictures. So he's wondering what's going on. Everyone's in this joyous mood. Everyone's happy, except the baby. Baby's not too happy. Then the masked man takes a knife in his hand, and he cuts off the foreskin of this 8-day-old baby. You're nuts. And no one in the room is stopping him. An 8-day-old baby with a guy with a knife that's bigger than... Someone stop that man. No, but what do all the adults do? They yell out, Mazel Tov, congratulations. Now you can eat. Tell me, what does our Martian think of us? You're nuts. You're crazy. Strange. So the lack of information leads us to rational conclusions that we would all agree that that individual that never seen this before is correct in the way he looks at what he just saw. From his perspective, without knowledge, without understanding, without any of it, even with the knowledge, some of us squirm, right? The mother of the child usually is not yelling Mazel Tov. There's usually tears in her eyes as she hears her baby cry. That's the natural response. For the uninitiated, someone who has no clue of the Bible or of tradition, they come from another planet, they think that this is a strange group of people. Another example. You wake up in the morning. This is, I guess, pre-internet when you have all the information at the click of a little button, but let's just rewind the clock 15 years. You get in your car, you drive to 7-Eleven, and you buy the newspaper. And you come home, and you sit down with a cup of coffee, and you read the news. If one would have to ask you, again, today no one does that, because you all have, from one click, you know exactly what's happening in every part of the world instantaneously, but let's suppose back in the day when you needed to go buy a newspaper. If someone were to ask you what you just did, you would say, not much. I drove 2 blocks to a 7-Eleven or to a stand that sold the newspapers, and I bought a newspaper, and I came up to have a cup of coffee. But yet, if we were to look at that very same scene and go back in time 2,000 years, think of the revolutions of time and of history that needed to take place for that small little tradition to happen. First thing is that you got into a car. What's a car? A box that moves? How does it move? I mean, they perhaps first came up with the wheel, with the tire, but the idea that the machine itself will carry you? You don't have the horse. Where's the horse pulling it? Is the horse hidden under the hood? The car. You went into a store and you used a coin, currency. What's currency? You bought a newspaper. What is it, about things that happened 200 years ago? No, it's about what happened yesterday. How could they possibly publish in one day something that happened in another part of the world? And that you would have it today. Again, today we can use the same example that it's instantaneously. The idea of free press, the idea that you have a right to know what's happening in other parts of the world, that wasn't always around. Everything that we take for granted 2,000 years ago would have been looked at as it's impossible, the revolutions that take place. Let's bring our Martian back on the scene today, okay? And he sees a human being walking, he's holding something and he's talking. The guy talks to himself. Not only he talks to himself, but he's using his fingers and he's trying. But he's not the only Meshuggah doing it. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's talking to themselves. They're not talking to each other. They're talking to themselves. They're holding this strange instrument and they're talking. Go on a subway these days and every single person on the subway, no one's talking to each other. Everyone's on their phones. Martians wondering what's with these people. And we try to explain to them, no, they're talking to each other, they're talking to someone in another place, but where's the connection? Where's the wire? Maybe if I saw a wire, I can understand it, but you don't see a wire. So we would have to start explaining things of the telephone, how the telephone came about, and then cellular phone, how that comes about, and waves that are in the air that you don't see and what that's all about. So without information, we're lost. The only thing that makes it work to some degree, makes sense, is that we have some gathering of information over the time. Our ignorance of understanding the phone network and sound waves and cellular phone antennas and all this sophisticated technology makes the guy on the phone look silly to the Martian. But the reality is that he's talking to someone, even though we don't see it with our eye. We are so tended to believe that it's only that which we see with our eye that's going on, and what we don't see, we don't seem to know about. What we don't see standing thousands of years now here in the opposite direction, after the days of the temple, after the temple was destroyed, is what was happening on the other end of the phone line. That's what we're missing. And because we don't see the other end of the phone line in the temple worship days, we're baffled by it, we're confused by it, and we're saying, we have a better system. We came up with a better system than God had back then in the Holy Temple. Well, if we just look at the words, we may not understand it, but we're missing seeing the cellular connection of what was going on at the time. The Arizal, great Arizal, explains that the sacrifices that took place in the temple were a way of elevating the matter and the vitality of this world to a higher plane. That actually was taking place at the time of the offering. There was an elevation that was going on. You see, when we pray, we elevate ourselves. We feel it. You feel more a little elevated, you feel more spiritual. But that's you. You yourself feel some type of elevation taking place. But you don't necessarily feel how creation, the rest of the world, everything else in this world is being elevated during your prayers. But let us suppose in the temple, when you brought the offering, you actually felt something of not just your being elevated, but the entire animal world was being elevated. And because the animal world ate of the vegetative world was being elevated. And because the vegetative world benefited from the mineral world was being elevated. What if that was your experience? You wouldn't feel the butcher shop feel. You wouldn't be focusing on the barbecue feel. You would be sensing at that time, wow. There is a reason we all lined up, we meaning our ancestors lined up to bring offerings. It wasn't because they were hungry for meat. It's because they were feeling that spiritual lift that came from bringing this. So as I've been explaining, creation is made up of 4 types of creation. Domem, which is the inanimate world, that's the mineral world. Someach is the growth, vegetative world. Chai is the animal world. The Medaber is the human being. And this process of the offering would raise up all 4 of these worlds. Do you know what the location of the altar was in the days of the Holy Temple? The spot that was selected to be the place where the altar was. It was the very earth that God used to make the first man. How was Adam formed? From the dust of the earth of the world. Which part of the earth? Jerusalem, Temple Mount, the exact spot where ultimately the altar would be put. That's the earth. Remember I said last week, the altar must be filled with what? Earth. It has to be connected to earth. It's all about taking original creation and connecting us there. It was the same place that Abraham would bring his son Isaac as an offering, even though he was told to stop. That it was just a test. But that was the spot. It's the same spot that Jacob had a dream. The dream of the ladders connecting heaven and earth. And what does Jacob say when he wakes up? He says, this is the gateway to heaven. The dream of the ladders meant this is the spot. This is the connection. So, in this physical world, we see everything as a physical place. But within the physical world, there was one spot that had this direct connection to the spiritual world. It was what we call the portal. That's the place. That's the connection. That's where the spiritual and the physical met. met. We were able to tune into that by bringing our offering on the earth of that spot. And you were actually able to feel it and experience it. So I can talk to you about a ride in Disneyland. I can tell you, wow, going on that ride was great. And you will think about it, you say, okay. But it's not like going on the ride. In the days of the temple, they went on the ride. When they brought that offering on that altar, that connected them to the very original energy which God used to create the world, and you felt it. That connected them to that portal that connected the spiritual world to the physical world, and you felt the elevation of the entire physical world. You felt it at the time. So all the offerings traveled through this portal and thereby transformed the physical world into a more spiritual place and elevated all of humanity. There's a verse in the book of Leviticus that the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, focuses on. And it's a verse that says this: if a person wants to come closer to God, these are the types of animals that they should bring. But when he focuses on the Hebrew, the way it's written, he says the language is incorrect. The way it's written, where the comma is, it's not reading correct. Because it says, Adam, a person ki yakriv, if he wants to come close to God, mikem, from you. Not Adam mikem, if one of you want to come close to God. If you want to come close to God, from you. The from you is in the wrong place. And he explains, it's from you. It's got to come from your animal. Meaning, the animal was a symbol of your own animal. We all have an animal within us. That's our animal soul. You want to come close to God? Are you prepared to offer your animal? Your own animal. If you're prepared, if we can go through this mentally, emotionally, spiritually, then we'll go through the ritual of bringing a physical animal as the offering, as everything I said. But first, the question really was from the Kohen to the person bringing it, are you prepared to offer your animal? Because we each have that animal soul within us. Now, there's a verse that says, let me find it so I read it to you correct. An ox run amok will trample and destroy. You have an ox. If you don't take care of the ox, it's going to run into people's fields and it's going to trample and it's going to do a lot of harm. But that very same ox I can hook him up to a plow, I can take him into a field and it can plow a field, and the great fruits and vegetables can come from the ox's work. It's the same ox. What changed? The harness. Did I harness the ox properly? Did I use the ox properly? If left unchecked, it's a wild ox and it can cause a lot of damage. We each have that ox within us. You want to allow your animal soul, your animalistic desires to run free, it will take you into trampling on other people's fields. Do you want to harness it? Not destroy it. Your animal soul is not bad. The fact that you want to eat is not bad. The fact that you want to enjoy life is not bad. There's nothing bad about your animal soul. But if left unchecked, if not harnessed, it can take you into places you don't want to go. Are you prepared to bring your animalistic instincts and bring it closer to God? Not destroy it. Bring it closer to God. This was all what was going on with all of these animal offerings that we read about. There was something much deeper that was happening here. I'll close with this and I'll tell you what we'll start with next week. There's a famous story in the book of Samuel. Samuel was the prophet that lived during the days of King Saul and King David. He's the one that anoints King Saul. He's the one that anoints King David. He's one of the greatest prophets of all time. There's a book of Samuel. There's a book 1 and book 2 of the book of Samuel. If you haven't ever read it, you should read the stories of the days of Samuel the prophet. In one of the stories towards the latter part of King Saul's reign, which actually brings about the latter part of King Saul's reign. King Saul was a great king. At the end of his life, he messes up. But we shouldn't take away from his greatness because he did great things under his leadership. Samuel comes to him with a mission from God. The prophet speaks to God and delivers the message. And the message was that the nation of Amalek is a terrorist nation. And they have to be destroyed. You have to go to war with them, and you have to wipe them out, because otherwise they will continuously terrorize the people. And you're the king, and you've got to wage war against them. Just wipe out that nation, because if you leave them alive, they're going to continuously harass you and continuously have terrorist attacks against your people. I want Amalek destroyed, says God, including everything that's part of that nation. The animals as well, everything got to go. King Saul wages war against Amalek. He's victorious in the battlefield. He makes two mistakes. He brings all the animals, the kosher animals from Amalek to the Mishkan because he wants to bring it as an offering to God. And he keeps the king alive to parade him through the streets of Israel to say, look, our victory, we've brought the king back as our captor, to be captive here. God says to Samuel, go tell King Saul that I'm extremely disappointed in him, and the days of his reign will now come to an end, because he didn't listen to me. If you read in the book of Samuel 1, chapter 15, verses 7 through 23, it's this very powerful exchange between Samuel and Saul. And Saul says to Samuel, I don't understand. I did it so well. I followed your marching orders so well. Look, I brought the king back as a prisoner of war. That's how victorious I was. And look, I brought all these animals. I'm going to bring them as offerings to God. And Samuel says this line, has the Lord desire in burnt offerings and peace offerings, as in obeying the voice of God? Behold, to obey is better than a peace offering, and to hearken is better than the fat of rams. If you're getting carried away, that God is hungry, and that's why he wants these offerings, and God can't wait until he has the smell of some offering going on in the Holy Temple, or he's hungry and he wants a burger for lunch, or he wants a lamb chop today. If you think that what God wanted are these animals brought, then you're missing the whole point. God wants you to listen. Listen to him. Listen to the instructions. Follow what he's asking you. That's more important than any offering that you can possibly bring. And that's what we're going to take off next week. Are we following what God wants us to bring, or are we doing what we think? And I'll share the story next week that I've shared numerous times. It's one of my favorite stories of all time. And that's the story of the heart in the ark. If you've heard it before, too bad. You will hear it again next week. If you haven't heard it, it is, if you want to understand prayer, if you want prayer to be more meaningful, come next week and listen to the story of the heart in the ark, and you'll have a better understanding of everything that we're talking about. Have a wonderful week, everyone. There's lunch for everybody, and I look forward to seeing you.